So, fine, this is a presentation I've been looking forward to because when I first read your application, I was struck by this combination between research on the Ballermann and on traditional Spanish rituals. And so you are a doctoral student in anthropology at Heidelberg University, and your research has a focus on schismogenesis, a concept that I and others are working with also, a really interesting concept, and celebratory practices at the Ballermann in Majorca. Your research is based on 15 months of fieldwork, which is quite a lot, and your paper today is From Tourist Gazes to Internal Presences, Notes on the Transformations of Majorcan Festivities in the Ballermann, a German nightlife hotspot in Spain. We are all looking forward to your presentation. Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much for having me here. Yeah, well, here in Germany is known as like kind of the German spring breakers. The German spring breaker, Ballermann, so I already heard some of. Yeah, so today I will want to talk a little bit about how local communities in Playa de Palma, or it's Germany known as Ballermann, in Majorca, how they resist this party tourism by reinventing their own tradition. So this 5 kilometers long playa, which you can see here, practically from Castilla to Arenal, has been up until now a very well-known international nightlife hotspot since the 60s, but before that it was, and this is quite unknown, like a traditional mining site with magnificent dunes and pine trees where rich family from the Palma city and also from Llucmajor used to come to spend the summer in what is called in Spain as veraneo. But it was also a mining site where several hundreds of traditional miners known as Trencadors used to pick out stones, and they were called breakers of the stone or Trencador. And they are quite important in the culture of Majorca because they are, let's say, the bedrock of all the architectural landscape in Majorcan culture since the conquest in Majorca in the 13th century. A good example is, for example, the Palma Cathedral of Gothic style built between the 14th and 17th century, and where you can still see the names of the syndicates from Trencador. So the last bastion of this kind of trade was exactly where Ballermann is. So that's why it's interesting to see that all this this landscape of Marès went to hell, as my interlocutor will say, with the tourist boom in the 60s and 70s. So Playa de Palma originated, which is actually, as some say, a Francoist toponym, originated with the Francoist regime endeavor to attune Spain to the more post-war atmosphere of international cooperation and Atlanticism. And the famous campaign, Spain is Different, like successfully attracted a lot of North Europeans to the island, and a lot of love romantic relationship in that time were to see also in the press, for example. From the 16th on, a certain liberalization brought Majorcans and tourists actively to share this robust nightlife scene equipped with around 30 international discos for all tastes. Of course, Trencadors, they used to go there. Some of them, they still exist. The women went to go in the hospitality to work, and so step by step, the Trencadors trade came to an end. So the post-Francoist liberalization in the 75 was a crucial aspect to this. But after 2 decades of very intense contact between tourists and locals in party settings, above all in Playa de Palma, what is called now Ballermann, but it wasn't known like that, came to an end because in the 90s the German tourism became dominant, and it is now called like the Ballermann. It is basically massively popular. They became massively popular with the comedy Ballermann 6 by the end of the 90s. So the conditions of the Ballermann to rise are schismogenic. So it is a pattern in Mediterranean resorts in which locals slowly are excluded for nightlife activities, and they start to be just the spectators. So the local bars are closed step by step, and the German party halls became massive. For example, the Megapart, the Bia König, all very different. But there was also before this dynamic. So the local becomes much more small. The halls from tourists much bigger, and you have also for example, in Lloret de Mar, which is one of the only ethnographies that I have found, like literally 1 year or more doing field work. Alix Poirot, a French anthropologist, she speaks about, after the 90s, counterintuitively of a restricted party, un fait encadré, including homogenization, de-Hispanization, segregation of locals' community, and specialization in young audiences. So in my terms, and schismogenic celebration. So what is schismogenesis? For all that don't know this kind of concept, it's an old concept from Gregory Bateson, 100 years ago, also before in the in-between wars. And at the time it was groundbreaking because it basically challenged like the functionally orthodox school and also the anthropology from Radcliffe Brown. And it was kind of difficult to challenge these schools at the time. It revived add-ons and reverse project of psychologically funded anthropology, and also with diachronic approaches. So this concept explains the origin of polarization, or one of a lot of concepts that explain it. And the definition is some kind of tricky. It's a process of differentiation in the norms of behavioral pattern that results from cumulative interaction between individuals. So here is how Graeber and Grengro recently explain it. Actually, they use it a lot. So imagine two persons discussing some minor political issues, and after a while, they end up taking positions radically opposing of some ideological divide. So people come to discuss all of a sudden things that belong to a level, but they become to discuss things in a level that actually belong to another level. For example, when you say, "Oh, that discussion got too personal," you're discussing the personal with technical arguments. So schismogenesis describes this communicative disturbance on various levels. For example, how an individual is being affected when social polarization is having some effect in his communities. It might be symmetrical, for example, in the case of arms race, today's topic, or complementary in an individual level, for example, submissiveness and dominance pairing. So it leads people to do things they don't really want to do or think, only for the sake of holding a opposing position. So in my case, this schismogenic is kind of a clear boundary. In schismogenesis, the clear boundary between yours and ours tends to blur. The counterparts end up joined by a system focused on exaggerated differences linked together with self-aggrandizing properties. The result, quote unquote, from Bateson, the members of each group see the stunned parts of their own affective life fully developed, indeed overdeveloped, in the members of the other group. So the patterns of behavior that originally used to work, they disrupt. In place of patterns of behavior which were perhaps originally adopted in an attempt to fit with the other party, we now have patterns of behavior which are definitely a reaction against the other party. For example, in a toxic romantic partnership, both sides over-specializing in one direction and only waiting the other's defects. So you can feel it also when you have a kind of a partner, a discussion with your partner. At times you say, let's do not cumulatively interact, because this is somehow a kind of a contrast to schismogenesis. But imagine when you have two big nations doing an arms race, the point is when are going to stop interacting. So in Playa de Palma, I witnessed from 2019 to 2023 this abysmal contrast in a celebratory fashion. The retraditionalization of popular festivities schismogenetically linked to the Ballermann. The Ballermann. Gabo Szabo defines it along the lines of Gerhard Schulz's experience of society as a post-traditional, extraordinary experience in the context of an intoxicating communalization. On the local side, you have Festivities as the demon of the suns, the Demonides des Arenas, which is a non-fire demon that comes out in historic plazas and in special days in Arenal summer festivals. Of course, now I'm mixing Arenal, Playa de Palma, Ballermann, so these are, even though it's the same place, physically, they are different landscape. So it is reinvented these kind of demons, for example, in 2017, with an emphasis on territory and hardly tolerates some tourist presence. So you have this schismogenic tension, the demonic wanting to reclaim what locals perceive as a lost space, while tourist party progressively becoming alien to locals, taking place over the years at their home, using their place where they used to celebrate and actually doing the things that they used to do decades ago. So the question is how people intend to go beyond mere polarization, this schismogenic tension. And beyond means always a higher level of complexity. So in this region, this is the map from the Ballermann, as of course informal. So in this region, which was ultimately the last bastion of Marès trade, why not to relate it to a symbolic imagination of a non-tourist world of life? People's wager in this case was to go back to the roots, or better, to go back to the stones, resorting to the most pristine wisdom related to the old miners and the forefathers of the land. So in July, in 2019, Cadena's neighbors, which is part of Arenal, carry out what they call a proposta descabellada, a crazy, challenging plan that resulted, it was not planned, resulted a small festivity. They invited the last two old Trencadors from the region to quarry Marès in an old-fashioned way. So let me give a little bit of detail about this event. The two Trencadors were Martí, the one in the left side, Martí Salva, a rather quiet and unknown Trencador from another neighborhood, and Chisco Vic, a talkative, boasting, controversial community member. All the participants were descendants from Trencadors and had participated in homages to Trencadors, seen their pictures, heard thousands of stories, not the most beautiful ones, basically learned all this in a technical or a conscious way. They had also visited, for example, Chisco's big museum, the other Trencador, who committed himself to gather a collection of pictures and tools and so on, and set up a museum at his home. But except of two of them, none of them had witnessed the very formal way of picking out the stone with escodra, which is what he's grabbing, which is a handmade pick with which Trencador used to do the most hard work. The relationship to tourism in this case is very structural, simple but dense. Picaram's escodra was representing the pre-tourist period. In this case, I am working out with the Edward Hall distinction between the formal, the informal, and the technical as grades of consciousness in knowledge-learning situation, because the technical is knowledge learned fully consciously, and the formal is this kind of unconscious wisdom, the hidden dimension of culture. As said, that Sunday we headed for the quarry early on in the morning. And as people affirmed afterwards, they didn't know what we were going to do. The basic idea was just to see how it was before. So Martí, in suddenly grabbing his escodra, which it became like a kind of, I don't know, like a kind of shaman, and picking out the stone, the oldest and silent Trencador, Matisse allowed us to witness an embodied technique that has not used it for 50 years. He hasn't used for 50 years this kind of escodra. The other Trencador, with his relentless explanatory speech, somehow was obscured. So this formal pattern used by Martí, a formal or internal presence of the culture, would trigger awe and a veritable emotional shock among participants. People's silence emphasized the iterative rhythmic sounds of the hits against the sandstone. They couldn't emphasize enough like this Marty's action. They say, I was amazed. It was spectacular. I had seen the tools, but I had never seen something like that. Imagine, with 90 years old, I perfectly remember how Marty grabs a scutter and immediately transforms himself. Anyway, he was about to experience firsthand a whole era irretrievably gone. Marty blessed us with a perception of something that has disappeared, which I call it like the Trencador in the sandstone, which enabled an epistemic shift from the technical knowledge for decades and decades of just seeing pictures and stories to the more formal congruity of seeing the very pattern of Picard and Scodra. As an interlocutor say, I saw Marty and immediately oriented myself. I clearly remember how my father would leave home, walk towards the Pedrera, and hear the boom, boom, boom. There was no stress, any stress. It just was a hard work, but they did not have in mind anything else than boom, boom, boom. At the time, I would sit down and talk, but well, and after all, I would keep quiet. But why? Well, because I love to hear the boom, boom, boom. I love to see those people telling, and sometimes I like to focus and think with this sound. When I do it, it seems to me that I hear a CD in my mind. So after this, you had like a celebratory response, the people trying to pick out the stones in the most hilarious way, using the pick as a spud, the spud as a hamper, the hamper as a pick, those recombining the use of these tools, trying to following the forefathers. Marty, actually, just with arm folded, was gazing and thinking, my God, you will starve to death if you had to make living doing this. At the end of the day, they uproot the piece of Marès to the explosive applause of the presence, and the piece end up retransforming actually the Ciscadenas yearly festivals in a very important way. I cannot tell you that much, but the interesting things is that with this apparently simple pedagogical experiment that turned to be a fiesta, the Caderners managed to extract from the soil a survival metaphor to address the Ballermann tourists in what they call the Trencadors. This is from the Trencador in the sandstone to Trenca tourists, Trencadors. So it was a performative show in the 2020 parade, which was called Breaking Tourist. So the semiotic homology between breaking tourist and breaking stone is not irrelevant. The trait of Marès implied actually a true act of difference, ultimately between human body and the sandy matter, with which Trencadors define the limits of their community. The most basic and hence complex Majorcan wisdom organized the cosmos according to this divide, not between tourists and locals, but actually between something much more relevant, between matter and human bodies. And also, of course, tourists. They have a human body. So the schismogenic dynamic gets at least temporarily reframed. Bateson speaks always about a temporary redressing, because Caderners restored in the carnival a sort of performative complementarity between Trencadors and Ballermann, and interrelatedness, because what they did here is, while the Trencadors used to pick out the tourists as if they were stone, then after a minute, the Ballermann continues to bother the Trencador. So it was a kind of symbolic complementarity. So the circuitry called Trencadors plays this related identity, certainly not without conflict, on the same level, while elevating the Marès, these uncontrollable forces of nature against which nature are defined, to a higher level of complexity. So instead of heading for tourists, we headed for the stones. And additionally, it shows something related to the theory of celebration, very well put by Jean Duvignon, the ambiguity. Although it might be subsumed, celebration, although it might be subsumed to schismogenesis, it might also be a modality in which people try to control it. So, thank you very much. This is about